She sold everything she owned, bought a one-way ticket, and traveled hundreds of miles to marry a man who promised her a new life, only to stand alone on an empty platform and discover the truth. He never existed. No money, no home, no one who knew her name. Most women would have turned around and gone back. Evelyn Harper didn't. What she built from the wreckage of the worst day of her life is a story worth staying for. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and follow so you don't miss what happens next. The train pulled into Black Ridge just after 4 in the afternoon, and Evelyn Harper pressed her face to the window glass the way she had been doing for the last 40 miles. Not out of excitement anymore, but out of something closer to habit. The landscape outside had flattened into a long, colorless stretch of dry grass and pale sky, interrupted only by the occasional cluster of cottonwood trees standing at odd angles like men who had given up on standing straight. She had expected to feel something when she finally arrived. Relief, maybe. Or at least the particular kind of calm that comes after a long, terrifying decision has been made and the worst of the waiting is over. What she felt instead was her stomach drop. The Black Ridge Depot was barely a building, a low wooden platform, a single ticket window with the shade pulled halfway down, a bench with one broken leg propped up by what looked like a folded grain sack. 3 men stood near the far end of the platform in dusty hats and dustier boots, but they were watching the freight car being unloaded, not the passenger doors. A woman in a gray dress held a child by the wrist and stared at nothing in particular. A dog of indeterminate breed slept in a patch of afternoon shade. No one was waiting for Evelyn. She told herself that was fine. She told herself he was probably running late, that ranching didn't keep to a train schedule, that the roads out here could be unpredictable, and she had known that before she ever bought the ticket. She gathered her 2 bags, one large, one small, both battered from the journey, and she stepped down onto the platform and stood in the thin October sun, and she waited. An hour passed. She sat on the bench with the broken leg, and she waited some more. The freight car finished unloading. The 3 men in dusty hats climbed onto a wagon and drove off without a backward glance. The woman in the gray dress collected her child and disappeared into the small collection of storefronts that constituted the main street of Black Ridge. The dog relocated its nap to the other side of the platform. The afternoon light shifted from gold to a cooler, flatter white, and the wind picked up off the open plain and found every gap in Evelyn's traveling coat with what felt like personal interest. She went to the ticket window. The man behind it had a face like old leather and an expression that suggested he had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. "I'm looking for a man named Gerald Holt," she said. "He owns a ranch about 12 miles north of here. He was supposed to meet the 4 o'clock train." The man behind the window didn't change his expression. He just looked at her for a long moment in a way that made her want to check if she had something on her face. "Holt," he said finally. "Gerald Holt. He wrote to me from Black Ridge. We have an arrangement." She kept her voice even. She had practiced keeping her voice even on the train when the doubt had gotten bad enough that she'd had to talk herself through it out loud in the empty space between her seat and the window. "Ma'am," the ticket man said, and then he stopped, as if reconsidering how much of what he knew he was actually required to share. "Please," she said. He scratched the side of his jaw. "There's no Gerald Holt 12 miles north of here. There's no Gerald Holt anywhere near here, far as I know. We got a Holt family used to have a claim about 30 miles east, but they packed up and left near 2 years ago. The old man passed. Sons went back to Missouri." Evelyn stood very still. "You sure about the name?" he asked, not unkindly. "I have his letters," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I'm sure you do." She understood then. She understood in the sudden, sickening way that you understand things you should have suspected but convinced yourself were impossible. The way a wrong note sounds obvious once you've already played it. She had read those letters 100 times. She had made herself believe in them because she had needed to believe in something. The handwriting was careful and the language was plain, and Gerald Holt had described the ranch and the land and what he wanted from a wife and a life, and she had thought, this is real. This is a real person offering a real future. She turned away from the window before the ticket man could see her face change. She sat back down on the bench with the broken leg. The dog had come back and was now regarding her with mild, sleepy curiosity. She put her hands flat on her knees and she looked at the plain stretching out beyond the depot, and she tried to calculate exactly how bad her situation was. It was bad. She had $43 and some change, which was what remained after the train fare, and the single night she'd spent in a boarding house in Cheyenne when she'd had to wait for the connecting line. She had 2 bags, a coat that was not quite warm enough for where she was headed into winter, and no one in Black Ridge who knew her name. She had left her previous life in Cincinnati with a finality that had felt brave at the time and now felt catastrophically stupid, had given notice at the milliner's shop where she'd worked for 4 years, had ended her lease on the 2-room apartment she shared with a woman named Dorothea who smelled like lavender and disapproval, had sold most of her furniture and some jewelry that had belonged to her mother. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. Her father had been useless for longer than that. She had no siblings, no close friends who would wire her money. No one who would come if she sent word that she was stranded in a settlement the size of a bad afternoon. The return ticket would cost her more than she had. She sat there until the light turned amber and the wind got meaner and the dog fell asleep again, and then she picked up her bags and walked into town to find somewhere to spend the night, because standing on the platform wasn't going to solve anything, and she had never in her life solved a problem by waiting for it to solve itself. The only place that rented rooms was a building that advertised itself as the Black Ridge Hotel, which was generous. It had 6 rooms on the upper floor and a dining room on the ground floor that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and wood smoke. The woman who ran it was named Mrs. Aldridge, stout, practical, with the careful eyes of someone who had learned to read strangers fast. "One night," Evelyn said, "and supper, if you're still serving. $1.50 for the room, supper's 30 cents. I'll take both." She ate alone at a corner table, salt pork, boiled potatoes, bread that had been baked sometime yesterday and was already heading toward tomorrow, and she thought about what to do. The dining room had a few other occupants, 2 men who looked like traveling merchants eating fast and talking low, an older couple who ate in the comfortable silence of people who have run out of things to say and made peace with it. No one paid much attention to her. That was a small relief. She had 3 options, as she saw it. The first was to wire someone back in Cincinnati and ask for money, but that meant admitting what had happened to people she wasn't sure she wanted to admit it to, and it would take time she wasn't sure she had. The second was to find work here, enough work to earn her train fare back, or enough to sustain herself until she figured out something better. The third was to find out who Gerald Holt actually was, and what had happened to the money she'd sent him. She had sent him $40. 2 months ago, when he'd written asking for it, to pay off a debt before they could marry, he'd said, a creditor who was pressing him and who would make their start together difficult, if not settled. She had known even then that it was not a sensible thing to do. She had done it anyway because she wanted to believe the story was true, and because $40 had felt like a reasonable price for hope. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and breathed out slowly. Around 7 that evening, she went upstairs to the room, small, clean enough, a window that faced the back alley, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she let herself feel it for exactly 10 minutes. The humiliation, the fear, the particular shame of having been taken in so completely, of having wanted something so badly that she'd walked straight into it with her eyes open. She had not been naive, she thought. She had been desperate, which was worse, because desperate people make the kinds of choices that naive people would know better than to make. 10 minutes, and then she washed her face with the water in the basin and changed into her other dress and thought about what to do next. Morning in Black Ridge came in gray and cold, with a smell of impending rain that never quite materialized. Evelyn was up before the dining room opened, sitting on the front step of the hotel with her coat buttoned to the throat and her notebook open on her knee. She had slept badly and thought productively, which was about the best she could hope for. She had a list. Employment possibilities in a settlement this size were limited but not non-existent. She could cook or clean. She could sew. She was good at it, had worked in a milliner's for years. She could keep books. She'd done the accounts at the shop for the last 2 years when the owner's eyesight started going. That last one was the most valuable skill she had, and also the one least likely to be wanted in a place like this. but she'd written it down anyway. She was reviewing the list for the third time when she heard the voice. "You're the woman who came on yesterday's train." She looked up. The girl standing in front of her was maybe 10 or 11, slight, with dark hair that had been braided badly. The kind of braid someone does for themselves because there's no one else to do it. She was wearing a coat 2 sizes too big and boots that had seen at least one previous owner, and she was looking at Evelyn with the direct, unself-conscious assessment of a child who has learned not to waste time on social niceties. "I am," Evelyn said. "You came to marry Gerald Holt." It was not a question. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Word travels fast. Mr. Hennessy at the depot told his wife, and she told everybody. The girl didn't say this apologetically. She said it the way you state a fact about weather. "There's no Gerald Holt." "I'm aware." "Are you going back?" Evelyn looked at the girl steadily. "I haven't decided yet." The girl appeared to consider this. Then she sat down on the step beside Evelyn without being invited, which Evelyn found she didn't mind particularly. "My name's Sadie Walker. My dad's got a ranch about 8 miles out. He's been running it by himself since my mother died." She paused. "It's not going very well." "I'm sorry to hear that." "He doesn't want help. He says he doesn't, anyway." Sadie looked out at the street, where a wagon was making slow progress through the mud. "But he needs it. He just doesn't know how to ask." Evelyn waited. She had the feeling the girl was working up to something. "You know how to read and do numbers?" Sadie asked. "Yes." "Could you do accounts? Like, if someone showed you what they had, could you figure out where the money was going wrong?" Evelyn studied the child's profile. She had seen adults with less composure than this girl was showing, which was either impressive or heartbreaking or both. "Depending on the records they kept, yes, usually." Sadie turned to look at her then. "Would you come out and meet my dad?" "He's not going to hire a woman he doesn't know to manage his accounts," Evelyn said. "Probably not right away. He's not going to want a stranger on his property." "That's true too. And you haven't asked him about this." "No." Evelyn almost laughed, despite everything. "You came to a woman you've never met, at 6 a.m, to invite her out to your father's ranch without telling him." "You don't have anywhere else to go," Sadie said, which was blunt enough that it almost stung, and honest enough that it couldn't. "And we don't have anyone who can help us, so I figured maybe it worked out." The street was getting a little busier now. A man in a canvas jacket crossed toward the general store. Somewhere down the block, someone was arguing with someone else about a price on something. The cloud cover sat low and close over the buildings, and the air smelled like the rain that kept threatening to come. Evelyn thought about her list. She thought about the $43 and some change. She thought about the room upstairs that cost $1.50 a night and would eat through what she had in less than a month, even if she skipped suppers. "I'll need to know more about the situation before I agree to anything," she said. Sadie's expression didn't shift into triumph or relief. She just nodded, like she'd expected exactly this and was satisfied to be moving forward. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Evelyn said. "Start with the debt." Debt. It took most of the morning to hear it all, sitting in the corner of the dining room over coffee that went cold before they were halfway through. Sadie Walker was not a dramatic storyteller. She spoke in facts, in sequences, with very little editorial commentary, and the picture that emerged from those facts was a ranch on the exact edge of collapse. Cole Walker was 34, had run the Double W Ranch for 11 years, had lost his wife Margaret to fever 2 winters ago. Margaret, by what Evelyn could gather, had been the one who kept the books and managed the suppliers and negotiated the contracts, and when she died, that side of the operation had effectively died with her. Cole knew cattle. He knew land. He knew how to work 16 hours and get up and do it again. What he didn't know, or at least what he hadn't managed since Margaret, was how to keep the money from going out faster than it came in. He had borrowed against the property twice. Once for repairs after a bad storm, once to buy stock when a deal had seemed too good to pass up and had turned out to be merely bad rather than too good. He had 3 ranch hands who were loyal and efficient and hadn't been fully paid since August. His grazing agreement with a neighboring landowner was up for renegotiation in December, and he had nothing to offer the man that would keep the terms favorable. His cattle were healthy but thin, and the buyer he'd been counting on for the fall sale had pulled out at the last minute, citing market conditions, leaving Cole scrambling to find an alternative at lower rates. "He's not stupid," Sadie said. She said it firmly, the way people defend someone who's been accused of something before the accusation is even made. "He just doesn't know what he doesn't know, and nobody's told him." "Who handles the banking?" "He does, mostly. He goes to Mr. Delacroix at the bank once a month and they talk, and Dad comes home quieter than when he left." "What does Delacroix tell him?" "That he has until February before they call in the first loan." Sadie wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "February's 4 months away." 4 months. Evelyn turned that over in her mind. 4 months to turn around an operation that had been sliding for 2 years, with no bookkeeper, underpaid hands, a bad grazing agreement, and a reluctant owner who, according to his 11-year-old daughter, didn't know how to ask for help. "He's not going to want me there," she said. "I told you that." "I'm saying it again so we're both clear. This is going to be difficult." "Everything's difficult," Sadie said, with the flatness of someone who has arrived at this conclusion through experience rather than philosophy. Evelyn picked up her coffee cup and found it cold and put it back down. She thought about her mother, who had worked herself to bone dust in a city laundry and died of it. She thought about the letters from Gerald Holt, which she had tied with kitchen string and packed at the bottom of her smaller bag, and which she intended to turn over to whatever passed for law enforcement in this territory, because someone was running that scheme on women who had very little and couldn't afford to lose it. She thought about what it meant to be standing at the exact bottom of a situation with nothing to recommend you except that you were still standing. "All right," she said. Sadie looked at her. "I'll come out and meet your father. No promises beyond that. He may throw me off the property." "He might," Sadie agreed. "And if he does, you're going to tell him you went behind his back to bring a stranger to his ranch." "Not me." The girl's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "I can do that." "Good." Evelyn stood up and pushed in her chair. "Give me half an hour to get my bags." The road out to the Double W was 8 miles of rutted dirt track that wound through scrub grass and past a dry creek bed and up over a low ridge that gave a long view of the valley below. Sadie drove a small wagon with a stolid brown horse named Fletcher, who had opinions about his pace and defended them. They didn't talk much on the drive. Sadie wasn't a talker, Evelyn was thinking, and Fletcher set a rhythm that wasn't conducive to conversation anyway. The ranch came into view as they dropped down off the ridge. A main house, 2 stories, with a covered porch that needed attention on one end. A large barn, newer looking than the house. A series of smaller outbuildings. Fenced pastures stretching east toward the tree line, with cattle visible as dark shapes at the far end. A water trough near the barn that needed cleaning. It looked like a place that had been cared for once, and was still being cared for, but with less than it needed. The distinction was visible in small things, the porch boards, the gate that hung slightly wrong, the fence line that was straight and functional, but hadn't had a fresh coat of whitewash in some time. "He'll be at the barn," Sadie said. He was not at the barn. He was coming from the direction of the eastern pasture on horseback, and he saw them when they were still 50 yards from the house, and Evelyn watched him check the horse and sit very still for a moment, in the way that people do when they are trying to understand something before they have to respond to it. Cole Walker was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with the particular physical economy of men who work too hard to carry anything extra. He had dark hair that needed cutting and 3 days of beard, and he was wearing a coat that had seen every season for at least 5 years. He rode toward them at a controlled pace that was faster than a walk and slower than it would have been if he was pleased to see them. He stopped the horse at the edge of the yard and looked at Sadie and then at Evelyn and then back at Sadie. "Who's this?" he said. Not a question so much as a statement waiting to be corrected. "This is Miss Evelyn Harper," Sadie said. "She came in on yesterday's train." "I can see she came on the train." His voice was low and flat, and not hostile exactly, but not warm. "What's she doing on my property?" "I brought her." "I can see that too." Evelyn had had enough of being discussed as if she were a parcel someone had left on the porch. "Mr. Walker," she said, I apologize for arriving without notice. Your daughter thought it might be useful for us to meet. She's described your situation to me in some detail, and I have experience with accounts and ranch financing, and I thought it was worth at least a conversation. Cole looked at her for a long, level moment. His expression was the kind that didn't give much away, but his jaw had tightened slightly, and Evelyn had been reading people long enough to know what that meant. My daughter, he said very carefully, described my situation. Sadie, to her credit, did not shrink. I told her about the loans and the grazing agreement and the fall sale falling through, she said, and about February. The muscle in Cole's jaw moved again. He swung down from his horse and stood in the yard, reins in one hand, and looked at his daughter with an expression that had a whole conversation behind it. The kind of expression that says we're going to talk about this later. You had no right to do that, he said. I know. Those are my business. Mine. I know that too. Then why? Because we're going to lose it, Sadie said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, the first crack Evelyn had heard in it all morning. We're going to lose everything, and you won't let anybody help you, and I don't know what else to do. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Cole stood there holding the reins and looking at his daughter, and something moved through his face that he controlled before it could become fully visible. He looked away, toward the barn, for a few seconds. Then he looked at Evelyn. You came in on the train to marry Gerald Holt, he said. She kept her expression steady. I did. And there's no Gerald Holt. Apparently not. So you've got no money, nowhere to go, and my daughter brought you here. That's an accurate summary of my situation, yes. He was quiet again. He ran one hand down the horse's neck, not looking at either of them. Evelyn didn't speak. She had said what she came to say, and there was nothing to be gained by filling the silence with more of it. I can't pay you, he said finally. Not initially, she agreed. I understand that. Room and board for now. We can negotiate wages if the situation improves. If. He looked at her again. He had gray eyes, or something close to gray. The color was hard to pin down in the flat October light. They were the eyes of someone who had gotten used to having to figure out who he could trust, and had found the math consistently unrewarding. I don't need a bookkeeper, he said. You need someone, she said, and you know it. He said nothing. I'm not asking you to trust me, she added. I'm asking you to let me look at what you've got. 1 week. If I'm wrong about being able to help, or if we can't work together, I'll find my own way back to town. It was a long time before he answered, long enough that Evelyn started to accept that he was going to say no, and to think about what she would do when he did. Sadie, he said. Yeah. Get Fletcher in the barn and get him some water. Okay. Sadie took the reins from him and led the horse away without looking at either of them, and Evelyn noticed that the girl was walking a little faster than necessary and that her back was very straight. Cole turned to Evelyn. 1 week, he said. The bunkhouse has an empty room at the far end. It's not comfortable. I didn't come here for comfortable. He nodded, once, and walked toward the barn. Evelyn stood in the yard of the Double W Ranch with her 2 battered bags and the cold October air pressing in from all directions and the sound of cattle somewhere in the distance, and she thought, all right, this is where you are. Make something of it. She picked up her bags and followed Sadie to find out where she'd be sleeping. The room at the far end of the bunkhouse was small and smelled like it had been used for storage recently because there were marks on the floor where boxes had sat and a nail in the wall where something heavy had hung. There was a cot, a washstand, a small window that faced west, and a hook on the back of the door. It was cold. It would get colder. Evelyn set her bags down and looked around and thought, I have slept in worse. She had, in fact, slept in worse. The apartment with Dorothea hadn't had proper heat in the winter, and the window in her room had let in a draft that no amount of stuffing with rags had fully fixed. Before that, in the years after her father's drinking had consumed most of what he earned, there had been worse things than a cold room. She sat on the cot and let the quiet of the place settle around her. Outside, she could hear the wind moving through the pasture grass, and somewhere the low sound of cattle. And from the direction of the barn, Sadie talking to Fletcher in the conversational tone that people use with horses. The same tone they use with anything they love without complication. She pulled out her notebook and started a new page. At the top, she wrote, "Double W Ranch, current situation." And below that she began, from everything Sadie had told her and everything she'd seen on the drive in, to write down what she knew. The loans, the grazing agreement, the fall sale, the hands, the cattle count Sadie had given her, which was approximate at best. She had a week to figure out if any of this was salvageable. She had been in tighter spots than this. She wasn't sure she believed that entirely. But she wrote it down anyway, at the bottom of the page, because sometimes the discipline of writing something forces you into the obligation of making it true. The wind found the gap under the bunkhouse door and came in cold and low, and outside the light was starting to fail, and somewhere across the yard Cole Walker was probably standing in his barn figuring out whether he'd just made his situation better or handed a stranger another way to make it worse. And Evelyn Harper, 23 years old, penniless and stranded and burning with something that was equal parts fury and determination, turned to a fresh page and started to work. She found the ledgers on the second morning. Cole hadn't offered them. He hadn't offered much of anything since the afternoon she arrived. A brief, uncomfortable supper that first night where he and Sadie sat at opposite ends of a table built for more people, and Evelyn had eaten her salt beef and tried not to feel like she was intruding on a grief she didn't fully understand yet. Cole had asked her exactly 2 questions, whether she'd slept all right and whether she wanted coffee. Both times he'd accepted her answer and moved on without elaboration. He was not rude. He was also not present in any way that mattered, even when he was sitting 3 feet away. The ledgers were in a wooden box under the roll-top desk in the corner of the main room that served as Cole's office, which was not really an office so much as a corner with a desk that had accumulated the weight of everything he didn't know what to do with. Evelyn had asked Sadie where the financial records were kept, and Sadie had said the box under the desk. And when Evelyn had looked at Cole and raised an eyebrow, he had looked at the ceiling for a moment and then said, "Go ahead," in the tone of a man giving permission for something he suspects he will regret. She spent the better part of 2 days with those ledgers, and what she found was worse than she'd expected, which was saying something because she hadn't expected anything good. The records went back 7 years. The first 5 were Margaret's work, meticulous, consistent, written in a small, precise hand that spoke of someone who took the accounting seriously as its own discipline. Income and expenditure tracked to the month. Notes in the margin about prices, market conditions, decisions made, and why. Reading them, Evelyn got the clearest picture she would ever have of the woman who had run this place alongside Cole. And it was not a comfortable picture to sit with because it made the 2 years that followed so much starker. After Margaret died, the ledger entries became sparse, then sporadic, then nearly absent. Cole had made entries when he remembered or when something forced him to. Loan paperwork, a large purchase. But the careful tracking was gone, and with it any ability to see where the money was actually going. He'd been running the ranch on instinct and memory for 2 years, and instinct and memory were not equal to the task. The numbers, when Evelyn finally assembled them into something coherent, told a story she didn't want to have to tell him. The first loan, taken out 18 months ago for storm repairs, carried interest that had been quietly compounding in a way Cole hadn't fully accounted for. The principal had barely moved. The second loan, for the cattle purchase, had come from a different lender at a rate that was legal but not friendly, and the terms had a provision buried in the middle of the 3rd page that allowed the lender to accelerate payment if Cole missed 2 installments. He had missed one in September. The next payment was due at the end of November. The 3 ranch hands, men named Hector, Pete, and a younger one everybody called Birch, had been working since August on reduced wages with a promise of the difference being settled after the fall sale. The fall sale had fallen through. The difference had not been settled. It now totaled, across the 3 of them, just over $200. The grazing agreement with a man named Lawrence Tate gave Cole access to the eastern meadowland that his cattle used through fall and into early winter. That agreement expired December 1st. Tate had sent a letter, Evelyn found it folded into the back of the ledger, indicating that he was entertaining other arrangements and would need to discuss new terms before renewal. The letter was from September and had not been answered. Evelyn read the Tate letter twice and set it down on the desk and sat with it for a while. Then she went to find Cole. He was at the fence line on the north side of the property, replacing a section of post and rail that had come down sometime in the last week. He was working alone, which she was starting to understand was how he did most things. Hector and Pete were out moving cattle. Birch was repairing the roof on one of the outbuildings. The ranch ran on a kind of distributed, unsupervised competence that spoke well of the men Cole had hired and said something about his ability to choose people, even if it said less about his ability to talk to them. She walked across the north pasture with the Tate letter in her hand and the cold pulling at her coat and the grass stiff with the morning's frost still not fully melted. Cole heard her coming when she was about 30 yards out, looked up from the post he was setting, assessed that it was her, and looked back at the post. "The Tate letter," she said when she reached him. She held it out. He looked at it without taking it. "I know about the letter. You haven't answered it." "I've been busy." "Mr. Walker." She kept her voice level. "If Lawrence Tate finds another arrangement for that meadow, your cattle lose their winter grazing. You don't have enough pasture on your own land to carry them through to spring, not at the current head count. You'd have to sell down the herd at whatever the market gives you, which right now is not good." He drove the post into the ground with a mallet, 2 clean strikes. "I know that." "Then why hasn't the letter been answered?" He set the mallet down and looked at her, and she saw something in his face that was not quite anger and not quite embarrassment, something in between that had been sitting there a while. "Because I don't have anything to offer him yet. Tate wants better terms than last year. I can't give him better terms until I've got the cash situation sorted. And I can't sort the cash situation until—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together. "Until you have someone to help you sort it," she said. He didn't answer that. "That's what I'm here for," she said. "I know what you're here for." He picked up the next rail and fitted it into place. "Doesn't mean I have to enjoy it." She almost said something sharp. She made herself not. "I need to meet with your banker, Delacroix. I need to see the actual loan documents, not just your copies." "Why?" "Because your copies may not reflect the current balance accurately, given the interest terms, and I want to understand exactly what the bank's position is before we start trying to negotiate anything." He was quiet for a moment, fitting the rail, checking the level. "Delacroix is not going to talk to you." "He will if you're there." "I don't go to Delacroix until the end of the month. We don't have until the end of the month on the November payment." That landed. She saw it land. He set the rail carefully and straightened and looked at the tree line rather than at her, the way men do when they're recalculating something they've been refusing to recalculate. "When?" he said. "This week," she said. 3 days at the outside." He picked up the mallet again. "I'll drive us in Thursday." She walked back to the house across the frost-stiffened grass, and she thought, "All right, that's something. Otan." She had better luck with Hector, Pete, and Birch, which surprised her somewhat because she had expected hired men on a struggling ranch to view her arrival with the particular suspicion that people reserve for changes they didn't ask for. Hector was the oldest of the 3. Mid-40s, Mexican, had been with Cole for 6 years. He was the one who'd actually managed the work of the ranch day to day, the one the other 2 looked to when decisions needed making in the field. He listened to Evelyn's explanation of who she was and why she was there with his arms crossed and his face unreadable, and then he said, "The boss said you could look at the books?" "He did." "You find what I think you found?" "That depends what you think I found." Hector smiled slightly. It didn't reach his eyes, but it wasn't unfriendly. "That we're owed 2 months' difference in wages and there's no money to pay it." "That's part of it, yes. What's the rest of it?" She told him in broad strokes. The loans, the November payment, the Tate letter. She didn't have to tell him any of it. He wasn't owed an explanation, but she told him because she needed him to understand the full picture, and because she suspected Hector had been carrying a version of this knowledge for some time already and was tired of pretending he hadn't. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to start with the bank and the Tate letter. After that, I need to look at every cost that can be reduced without hurting the herd or the operation, and I need to find a buyer for the fall cattle sale." The buyer pulled out. "I know, there are other buyers." "Not many this late in the season, and the ones there know you need them more than they need you, which means I need to find more than one and let them know there's competition." She said it calmly. She was not inside calm. That's harder, but not impossible. Hector looked at her for a long moment, the look of someone measuring something without a ruler. Then he uncrossed his arms. Pete and Birch will work for whoever's giving orders, long as the orders make sense. They're not complicated. He picked up a brush and turned back to the horse he'd been grooming. I'll give you 60 days before I decide whether to stay. It wasn't enthusiasm, but it was more than she'd had an hour ago. Thursday came with low clouds and the smell of coming snow that didn't arrive. Cole drove the wagon into town with the silence he seemed to carry everywhere, and Evelyn sat on the seat beside him and reviewed the notes she'd made in her notebook and tried not to think about the fact that she was asking a man who didn't trust her to let her speak for him to a banker who had no reason to listen to either of them. The Blackridge branch of the Territorial Trust Bank was a single-story building with a newer facade that hadn't quite matched the older structure behind it, like a new shirt on an old body. Cyrus Delacroix was a compact man in his late 50s, with the careful, well-maintained appearance of someone who has decided that looking trustworthy is a professional skill. He met them in his office with the particular expression that bankers develop, attentive but non-committal, warm without actually offering anything. He looked at Cole, then he looked at Evelyn, and the look shifted just slightly, the way a calculation shifts when an unexpected variable appears. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I wasn't expecting you until the 31st. "We need to talk about the November payment," Cole said. He said it the way he said most things, flat, economical, no more than required. "Of course." Delacroix glanced at Evelyn again. "Miss Harper has been helping me review my financial situation," Cole said. "She'll be speaking to the numbers." A small hesitation, then, "All right." Evelyn put her notebook on the desk. She had organized everything she needed to say in a sequence, not leading with the problem, but with a clear picture of what the ranch actually produced, what its assets were, what the realistic path to solvency looked like over 18 months. She had done this at the milliner's when the owner had needed to negotiate with a supplier who'd raised prices, and she had learned then that the way to handle a conversation where you have less power than the other person is to come in knowing more than they expect you to know and to be more specific than they want to deal with. She walked Delacroix through the ranch's cattle inventory, the current market pricing, the production capacity, if the grazing agreement held, and what the operation looked like on paper if the November payment was restructured, deferred by 60 days added to the principal, with a modified repayment schedule that reduced the monthly burden enough to let Cole stabilize. Delacroix listened. He made notes. He asked 3 questions, all of them pointed, and she answered all 3 without having to check her notebook because she had already anticipated them. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at Cole. "She's thorough," he said, which was the kind of compliment that wasn't quite a compliment, acknowledging competence without fully crediting it. "She is," Cole said, in a tone that suggested Delacroix should probably take that at face value. "The restructuring you're describing isn't standard," Delacroix said, turning back to Evelyn. "I'm aware of that," she said, "but the alternative, calling in the payment on schedule when the ranch can't meet it, puts you in the position of foreclosing on an asset you'd then need to sell in a depressed market. This way you recover the interest over a longer period, and Walker keeps the operation running." Delacroix's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "You've thought about my position. Your position matters to the outcome." He tapped his pen against the desk twice. "I can take it to the board. No guarantees." "When can you have an answer?" 2 weeks. "That puts us at the end of the month." "Yes, it does." She held his gaze. "I'd appreciate it in 10 days if that's workable." Another small pause. "I'll see what I can do," he said, and the way he said it suggested he might actually mean it, which was more than she'd walked in expecting. Outside on the board sidewalk, Cole stood next to the wagon and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. The clouds had lowered since they'd come in. The air had that flat, pressed quality that meant snow wasn't far off. "You handled that better than I would have," he said. "You would have let him set the terms," she said. "Yeah." He climbed onto the wagon seat. "Probably." She got up beside him, and he clicked the horse forward, and they drove back through Blackridge's short main street and out onto the road home, and the silence between them was different than the silence on the way in. Not comfortable, not exactly. but less like two people avoiding each other and more like two people thinking about the same problem. The letter to Lawrence Tate, Evelyn wrote herself. She wrote 3 drafts. The first was too formal and ended up sounding like she was apologizing for being late. The second was better, but still hedged too much. The third she gave to Cole and said, "Read this and tell me what I've gotten wrong about your history with this man." Cole read it standing by the window where the light was better. She watched him reading and noticed that he held paper at a slight angle, like someone who'd learned to read in bad light and never unlearned it. "Tate's not a bad man," he said when he finished. "He's practical. He'll make a deal if the deal makes sense. I offered him first option on the spring calves at a fixed price, below market by about 4%, in exchange for holding the current terms through December and giving us a 30-day right of first renewal. 4%'s a meaningful number. He's getting certainty. That's worth something in an uncertain year." Cole read the letter again. "The tone's good," he said. "Not begging, not demanding." "Both of those would make things worse." He handed it back. "Send it." She sent it the next morning, with Birch making the ride to the Tate property since it was closer than town. Tate's reply came 2 days later. Not a full agreement, but an indication that he was willing to discuss the terms, and that he would come by the following Tuesday. It was the first thing that had moved in the right direction since she'd arrived. What? It didn't go unnoticed. She had been at the Double W for 9 days when she first heard the specific kind of talk that small settlements generate about women who show up in unexpected circumstances and start doing things that weren't anticipated of them. She heard it at the general store in Black Ridge, where she'd gone to price out supply costs as part of her review. A conversation that stopped just slightly too abruptly when she walked in and resumed at a lower register when she moved to the back of the store. She caught the phrase, "that Harper woman," and the phrase, "Cole Walker's got enough trouble," and then the conversation dropped low enough that she couldn't make out the words, only the tone. She bought what she'd come to buy and left without acknowledging it. It would get worse before it got better, if it got better at all. She knew that. There was a particular kind of small settlement hostility directed at women who were unattached and unaccounted for, who didn't fit the existing categories of wife, widow, daughter, or schoolteacher, and she had known it existed before she came here. Knowing it didn't make it comfortable, but it didn't surprise her either. What surprised her slightly was that Sadie had clearly already heard it. The girl mentioned it that evening in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything. "People in town are talking about you," she said. They were at the kitchen table, Sadie doing schoolwork that was nominally supervised by no one in particular, Evelyn working on a cost reduction analysis of the feed and supply purchases. "I know," Evelyn said. "Does it bother you?" "Not as much as losing the ranch would." Sadie considered this. "My mother used to say that people talk when they don't understand something. It means you've confused them." "Your mother sounds like she was a smart woman." Sadie looked down at her schoolbook. "She was better at everything than I am," she said quietly. Evelyn set down her pen. "That's not true." "You didn't know her." "No. But I know you handle things that would undo most adults, and you've been doing it for 2 years. And I'd guess your mother would find that more impressive than you do." Sadie didn't look up from the schoolbook. But something in her posture shifted, the almost imperceptible loosening of something that had been held tight. "She'd probably just say I should have neater braids," Sadie said. Evelyn felt the corner of her mouth move. "I can help with the braids if you want." Sadie looked up then, surprised in the particular way children are when adults offer something practical and small instead of the expected something grand. "Okay," she said. It became a morning routine after that. 5 minutes before breakfast, Sadie sitting on the edge of the kitchen chair, Evelyn working the comb through the knots with more patience than efficiency. They didn't always talk. Sometimes Sadie asked questions, the random, slightly angular questions of someone who has done most of their thinking alone and hasn't learned yet to sort which ones to ask out loud. "Where did you grow up? What's Cincinnati like? Did you ever want something and then get it and find out it was different than you thought?" "That last one," Evelyn answered carefully. "All the time," she said. "The important thing is figuring out what to do after that." "Is that what you're doing now?" "I think so." Cole walked in on this routine on the 4th morning it happened, walked into the kitchen for his coffee and stopped in the doorway for just a moment, looking at the two of them. His expression did something complicated and brief that Evelyn couldn't quite read. and then he poured his coffee and went back outside without saying anything. Lawrence Tate turned out to be a man of about 60, with a rancher's careful handshake and the kind of face that had been outdoors in all weathers long enough to lose the distinction. He arrived on Tuesday as indicated, looked over the double W with the assessing eye of someone who'd spent decades reading land, and sat down at Cole's kitchen table with his hat in his lap and listened while Evelyn laid out the proposal. He asked 4 questions. Evelyn answered 3 directly, and on the 4th, the question of whether the spring calves would be healthy enough to justify the fixed price, she said, "I'd let you have a look at the herd before you commit to anything. Make your own assessment." Tate looked at Cole, who was sitting at the end of the table with his arms crossed and his expression doing its usual thing of revealing very little. "Your woman know what she's talking about?" he asked, which was not the most gracious phrasing. "She does," Cole said. Tate looked back at Evelyn. Something shifted in his assessment of her. Slight, but visible. "Fixed price holds through May?" "Through May 15th, she said. "After that it reverts to market." He was quiet for a moment, running the numbers in his head with the practiced ease of a man who has done that calculation 1,000 times. 4% under market is worth more to me than the uncertainty of holding out, he said. "I'll agree to the December renewal, same terms. The spring calves will revisit in March once I've seen the condition." "Fair enough," she said. He shook hands with Cole and then, after a brief pause that said something about where he'd landed, with Evelyn too. After he left, Cole poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without asking and sat down across the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You didn't tell him the grazing agreement was the one thing we actually needed?" "No." He would have pushed harder on the price if he'd known. "Yes." He wrapped both hands around his cup. He had hands that showed 11 years of ranch work, scarred, calloused, with a crook in one finger from a break that had healed slightly wrong. "Where did you learn to negotiate like that?" "Watching a woman who was bad at it lose money for 4 years, she said. "My employer. She was a good milliner and a terrible businesswoman." Cole was quiet for a moment. "My wife was good at it," he said. "Margaret, she had a way of—" He stopped. He looked at his coffee. "Sadie mentioned her," Evelyn said, carefully. "Yeah." He was quiet again, the longer kind. "She'd have had all this sorted by now." "Maybe," Evelyn said. "Not maybe." "Okay. Probably." She picked up her own cup. "But she's not here, and I am. And what matters is that the agreement holds." He looked at her, and something in that look was different from the ones before. Less guarded, or guarded in a different way, the way you guard something you've started to value rather than something you're afraid will be taken. Then he looked back at his coffee, and the moment passed. "Delacroix sent word," he said. "The board agreed to the restructuring. 9 days, like you asked." She hadn't known that, hadn't had a chance to check the post. "That's good news," she said. "Yeah." He stood up, took his cup to the counter. "Hector said to tell you the south pasture fence needs 2 more days of work before we move the herd. I'll update the schedule." He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "Thank you," he said. He said it the way you say something when you mean it but are not used to saying it. Slightly awkward, slightly more honest than comfortable. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We've got a buyer to find." "I know." He pulled the door open and the cold came in for a moment, sharp and clean. But still. He went out. The door closed. Outside she could hear him crossing the yard toward the barn, his footsteps even and unhurried, and she sat at the table with her coffee going cold in her hands, and thought about what Margaret Walker must have sat at the same table and understood, and what she herself was only beginning to. The ranch was not saved. Not yet. The bank restructuring bought them breathing room, not solutions. The Tate agreement removed one emergency but didn't replace the income they still needed from the fall sale. A sale that had no buyer yet, with winter moving in from the north and the calendar not interested in anyone's difficulties. She turned to a fresh page in her notebook and wrote, "Buyers" at the top. And below that she wrote every name Sadie had mentioned, every market contact she'd found in the old correspondence files, every lead that existed, however thin. There were 7 names. She would start in the morning. She found a buyer on the 5th day of trying. His name was Robert Garner, and he ran a supply operation out of a town called Millhaven, about 60 miles southeast of Black Ridge. He wasn't the best option on her list. That had been a man named Sutton who'd bought from the Double W twice before, under Margaret's tenure, and who had sent back a polite letter explaining that he'd already committed his budget for the season. Garner was 3rd on the list, after a second contact who hadn't replied at all. But when Evelyn rode into Millhaven on a borrowed horse with her notebook and 3 weeks of ranch arithmetic in her head, Garner turned out to be a man who made decisions quickly and didn't require a great deal of convincing if the numbers worked. The numbers worked. Not beautifully. He offered 8 cents under the per-head rate she'd been hoping for, and he wanted delivery by the 20th of November rather than the end of the month, which compressed the timeline and added pressure to the logistics. But he shook her hand across his desk, and he didn't make her wait in the hall while he thought about it, which was more than she could say for the first 2 men she'd called on before reaching Millhaven, both of whom had found reasons to send her back to whoever her employer was before hearing her out. She rode back to the Double W in the last hour of afternoon light, with the signed agreement in her coat pocket, and the cold settling into her shoulders and the particular private satisfaction of something hard being done. Cole was at the water trough when she came into the yard, replacing a fitting that had been leaking, his hands red with cold and the sleeve of his coat dark where the water had got at it. He looked up when she came through the gate, and something in her expression must have told him before she said a word, because he straightened and waited. "Garner, in Millhaven," she said. "November 20th delivery. 8 cents under your target rate, but the volume makes up most of the difference." He was quiet for a second, then, "You rode to Millhaven and back in a day?" "It's 60 miles. On Hector's horse." He offered. She pulled the agreement from her pocket and held it out. "Delivery logistics are going to need work. The 20th gives us tight timing on the south pasture fence." He took the agreement and read it, still standing at the water trough with his wet sleeve and his red hands. She watched him reading and thought about how little his face gave away, even when she was starting to learn the small exceptions. The slight tension at the corners of his eyes when something worried him, the way his jaw reset itself when he'd made a decision he wasn't going to revisit. "This is good," he said. He said it simply, without the qualifications she'd half expected. "It's a start," she said. "No." He folded the agreement and looked at her. "This is good. You did good." She was not accustomed to being told that in that particular register, plain and without condition, and she found she didn't have a ready response for it. She said thank you and took her horse to the barn, and in the quiet of the stall while she unsaddled and brushed him down, she thought that the Double W was beginning to feel, in some way she couldn't fully account for yet, like somewhere she was supposed to be. That feeling lasted about a week before everything changed. What? She first heard the name Victor Blackwell from Hector. They were mending fence on the eastern boundary, a job that had been deferred twice already and couldn't wait any longer given the Tate agreement. And Hector had been quiet most of the morning in the particular focused way of someone doing physical work, when he straightened up and looked toward the road. A rider had stopped at the boundary fence and was sitting there watching them. Not a local rider. The horse was too well kept, the saddle too new. The man was perhaps 50, with a broad face and the upright carriage of someone who had spent a long time being the most important person in most rooms. He sat looking at the property with the unhurried attention of someone calculating a purchase rather than passing through. "Who is that?" Evelyn said. "Victor Blackwell," Hector said. He went back to the fence post without further comment, but his hands had slowed. "The land speculator?" She had heard the name once in town, in passing. "Among other things?" Hector drove a staple with 2 clean hits. "He's been buying up distressed properties from here to the county line for 2 years. Gets them cheap when the owners run out of options. Sells them to the railroad or to the farming companies that are moving in from the east." She watched the rider on the road. He hadn't moved. He was looking at the pasture, at the cattle on the far end, at the line of the property. Then, without acknowledging them, he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. "He's been watching this place before?" she asked. "Started coming around about 6 months ago," Hector said. "Nothing you could call a visit. Just looking. Has he spoken to Cole? Once. Came to the house with a business card and an offer. Mr. Walker told him to leave. What was the offer? Hector was quiet for a moment. I don't know the number. I know Mr. Walker came back inside with a look on his face like he wanted to hit something. She looked back at the road, which was empty now. Cole confirmed it that evening with the brevity she'd come to expect from him on subjects that involved the ranch's vulnerability. Blackwell made an offer 8 months ago, he said. Said he had buyers for the land who'd use it well. Used those exact words. Use it well. The flatness in his voice made clear what he thought of that. It was below what the property's worth. I told him I wasn't selling. Did he push? He said he understood, and he'd check back in. Cole looked at his coffee. He's not a man who takes a no seriously. He waits for circumstances to change. He thinks the debt is going to force your hand. Probably. She turned the implications over. The bank restructuring had bought them time, but it wasn't invisible. Bank proceedings in a small settlement had a way of becoming common knowledge through the ordinary channels of community life. Delacroix wasn't a gossip, but people talked, and someone who made it his business to know when properties were vulnerable would not have had difficulty reading the signs. He knows about the loan situation, she said. He'd know without trying hard, Cole agreed. Then he's going to be paying closer attention now that we've started turning things around. She was thinking out loud. If he's counting on the debt to force a sale and the debt gets managed, he loses his leverage. He'll want to find another pressure point. Cole looked at her. You think he'd interfere? I think he's been waiting this long because he expected the situation to solve itself for him. I think patient men do impatient things when patience stops working. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him weighing it. The part of him that didn't want to believe people operated that way against the part that had been on a working ranch long enough to know better. I'll talk to Hector, he said. Tell him to keep an eye on things. It wasn't enough. She knew it, and suspected he did too. But it was what they had. But the name Damien Cross she heard for the first time from Mrs. Aldridge at the hotel on a Thursday when she'd come to town to post letters and speak to the post office about the mail order correspondence she'd flagged for the territorial authorities. The Gerald Holt matter, which she hadn't forgotten and hadn't stopped being angry about. Mrs. Aldridge mentioned Cross the way people mention weather, as something that had arrived and would have to be dealt with. He came in on Tuesday's stage, she said. She was wiping down the counter with the energy of someone who cleans as a way of managing anxiety. Took the best room, paid 2 weeks in advance, which nobody does unless they expect to be doing business. What kind of business? He says he's a land attorney, has a very good coat. Mrs. Aldridge's assessment of men often came back to the quality of their outerwear as a proxy for character. He had dinner with Victor Blackwell last night. Evelyn kept her expression neutral. Do you know what they discussed? No, but they were at it for 2 hours, and Blackwell left looking satisfied, which is the expression I trust least on that man. She walked back to her wagon, thinking. A land attorney who arrived in Black Ridge and immediately met with Victor Blackwell was not coincidental. Men with good coats who paid 2 weeks in advance were not here for the scenery. She asked around carefully over the next 2 days. What she gathered was fragmentary and unconfirmed, but it began to assemble into a shape she didn't like. Damien Cross had operated in 3 other territories in the past 5 years. In each case, he had appeared in a settlement where a land speculator, not always Blackwell, but sometimes, was trying to acquire distressed property, and in each case he had found or manufactured legal complications that accelerated the owner's difficulties. A disputed boundary survey, a question about the chain of title, a creditor claim that arrived at a convenient moment. Nothing provably dishonest, or nothing that had been proven dishonest yet. Just complications, applied with precision. She put this in front of Cole on a Sunday evening, and he sat with it in silence for longer than he usually sat with things. If you find something wrong with the title, Cole said finally, we review the original land grant documents, she said. Make sure everything is in order. Where are those? The county register's office in Harlow. That was the county seat, 30 miles north. We should go this week. All right. He stood up and went to the window and stood there a moment looking at nothing. The night outside was clear and cold, with a moon that lit the yard in pale gray white. What else? Watch the cattle, she said. Watch the fences. Watch anything that could be interfered with. She paused. I know that sounds like I'm looking for trouble that may not be there. No, he said. He didn't turn around. It sounds like you've thought about this more carefully than I have. She didn't answer that, because it wasn't a question. Cross made himself visible on the following Monday, which was the day he walked into the Double W yard in that good coat and knocked on the front door. Evelyn answered it because Cole was out at the south pasture with Hector supervising the fence completion before the Garner delivery. Sadie was at the table doing lessons. Cross was a man of about 45 with a face that had been handsome once and still retained the structure of it, and he had the particular ease of someone who had learned to make his physical presence do work before he'd said a word. He held his hat in both hands and smiled at her. Miss Harper, he said, I'm Damian Cross. I'm a land attorney working on behalf of several parties with interest in this region. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Walker. He's not available, she said. When might he be? I'm not certain. You could leave a card. He smiled again, the patient smile of someone who has learned that patience is itself a kind of pressure. I might just wait, if that's all right. It's a fine morning. It's cold, she said. And Mr. Walker doesn't receive unscheduled visits. If you'd like to send a letter, I can make sure he sees it. Cross looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just a slight recalibration, the kind of look that says, I'm going to have to be more careful about this one. You're very protective of his time, he said. I manage the ranch's business interests, she said. His time is a ranch asset. He held the smile a moment longer, then let it ease. I'll send a letter, he said. Ms. Harper, was it? You came in on the October train. I did. Interesting circumstances. He said it lightly, as if he was not making a point. I hope Black Ridge has been welcoming. She said nothing. He put his hat back on, tipped the brim to her, and walked back across the yard with the unhurried ease of a man who has just gathered information he intended to gather all along. She closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. Who was that? Sadie called from the table. Someone we need to keep away from the property, Evelyn said, and went to write down everything about the conversation while it was still precise. The letter came 3 days later. Evelyn read it twice before she let Cole see it, which she told him she'd done, and he looked at her in a way that said he would have done the same. The letter was written in the careful, technically precise language of a man who has spent years making things sound both reasonable and unmovable. It cited a question about the Eastern Boundary Survey dating from the original land grant, a discrepancy cross-claimed between the survey on file with the county register and a secondary survey conducted by a private firm on behalf of an unspecified client. If the discrepancy was substantiated, the letter noted, it could affect the legal standing of the grazing agreement, the accuracy of the property tax filings for the past 7 years, and potentially the validity of the loan since the collateral value depended on the boundary being what Cole believed it to be. None of it stated directly that there was a problem. All of it implied that there might be one, and that Cross was in a position to determine whether there was. He doesn't have anything yet, Evelyn said. He's fishing. He wants us to respond from a position of anxiety, which will tell him more than whatever we say. So we don't respond anxiously, Cole said. We go to Harlow first thing tomorrow and pull every document in that file. If the survey is clean, we can answer from a position of certainty. If there's an actual discrepancy, there isn't. You're sure? He was quiet for just a beat too long. Cole. My father had the survey redone in, I think it was 79. There was a question about the northeast corner that came up when Tate's predecessor was setting his boundary. They sorted it. He rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know where the updated survey went. It may be in the county file. It may be in a box somewhere. She looked at him. We need to find it. I know. They went to Harlow the next morning. The county register's office smelled like old paper and coal dust, and the particular dense quiet of places where records go to be misunderstood by everyone who comes looking for them. The clerk was a thin young man who seemed vaguely threatened by the nature of their request, but produced the file after 20 minutes of searching. The original survey was there, clean, properly filed. The updated survey from 1879 was not. Evelyn sat at the clerk's table with both hands flat on the file and worked through the implications. Without the updated survey, the original document stood as the official record. And the original survey had the northeast corner discrepancy that the 1879 work had corrected, which meant Cross could, if he pursued it, use that discrepancy as a legal lever, not necessarily to win a boundary dispute, but to cloud the title long enough to create the kind of uncertainty that made banks nervous and buyers reconsider. The updated survey has to exist somewhere, she said. My father would have had a copy, Cole said. He was standing behind her, reading over her shoulder. He kept everything. When he died, it all went into boxes. Those boxes are at the ranch? In the attic. She looked at the clock on the register's wall. It was just past noon. They had a 3-hour drive back. We go home and we find those boxes tonight, she said. They found it at 11 o'clock that night, in the third box Evelyn opened in the attic, by lamplight, with the cold coming through the attic's single small window, and Sadie asleep downstairs, and Cole beside her going through the papers with the systematic patience of someone who has decided to see a thing through. The document was there, so he properly drawn, with the surveyor's certification and the date, February 14th, 1879, and the northeast corner measurement that corrected and superseded the original. Evelyn held it in the lamplight and let out a slow breath. That's it? Cole asked. That's it. She handled it carefully, as if it might decide to become something else. We get a copy made and filed with the county register first thing next week. Once it's officially on record, Cross has nothing to work with on the boundary question. Cole looked at the document for a moment. Then he looked at her. You knew to look for this. I suspected he'd go for the survey. It's a predictable play for someone with his record. You researched his record. I asked around. She set the document down on the box and rubbed her eyes. They'd been up there for 2 hours. He's done this before, Cole. He's not improvising. This is a method. He was quiet for a moment. In the lamplight, he looked tired. Not the surface tired of a hard day's work, but the deeper kind. The kind that accumulates over 2 years of fighting the same losing battle and not knowing if it was ever going to change. Why is he doing this for Blackwell? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Money, she said, and probably an arrangement on the property once it transfers. It's not going to transfer. No, she said. It's not. He picked up the lamp. She picked up the surveyor's document. They went back downstairs in the particular quiet of two people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side of it still standing. But Blackwell and Cross did not stop. She should have expected that. She did expect it, in some part of herself that had been tracking the situation with the cold attention it deserved. What she hadn't anticipated was the speed of the next move, or the form it took. The Garner delivery was 9 days out when Pete came back from the north fence line at a run, which was how Evelyn knew before he reached the yard that something was wrong. Pete was not a running man. He was methodical and unhurried in everything, which was part of what made him good at his work. He was running now. Cattle on the north section, he said when he got close enough. He was out of breath. About 40 head. Not ours. She was already moving before she fully processed the sentence. Where's Cole? South pasture with Hector. She sent Birch to get them and rode out with Pete to the north section herself. And what she found was 43 head of cattle bearing a brand she didn't recognize eating through the north pasture grass at a rate that would take a meaningful bite out of the grazing they needed to carry their own herd through to the Garner delivery date. Cole arrived 18 minutes later, took one look, and his face went very still. That's a Crest Fork brand, he said. That's Blackwell's operation. His cattle are on your land. His cattle are eating my grass. The flatness in his voice had an edge under it now. 10 days before I need that pasture for the delivery herd. They spent the rest of the day pushing the Crest Fork cattle back across the north fence line, which had been cut, cleanly, deliberately, in 3 places. Not an accident, not a wandering herd. It was not something she was good at. He returned 2 hours after dark. His expression was the careful blank of someone managing anger with the full weight of their will. Blackwell says his cattle broke through a damaged section, he said. Says he's sorry for the inconvenience. Says he'll have his men come retrieve them. He pulled off his coat and hung it. He was not sorry. Did he threaten you? Not directly. He said he hoped the property business wasn't causing me too much difficulty. Said he'd heard there were some legal questions about the boundary. Cole's mouth was a flat line. Said his offer was still open if things got complicated. She had known something like this was coming and still felt the cold clarity of it settling in. He's not going to stop, she said. No. Cross isn't done either. Filing the survey will slow him down, not stop him. I know. He sat down at the table. He looked like a man who had been fighting something for so long that the fighting itself had become a kind of normal, and what was hard now was accepting that it had gotten worse. What do we do? She had been thinking about that for 2 hours. We go on offense, she said. Cross has a record in other territories. If we can document it, find people who dealt with him before, get statements, build a file, then whatever he tries here, we have context that makes it look like a pattern rather than a legitimate legal concern. That takes time. Yes. And it takes someone willing to travel or correspond with people in other territories. He looked at her. You. I can do the correspondence from here. If it needs a personal visit, that's harder. Birch can make rides if you need a messenger. All right. She pulled her notebook toward her. I'll also talk to the sheriff tomorrow about the fence. It was deliberate destruction of property. I want it on record, even if nothing comes of it. Henderson's a decent man, Cole said. He won't like Blackwell, but he'll be careful about what he can prove. Being on record matters regardless of what he can prove right now. Cole nodded. He was looking at the table. Then he looked up and said, Evelyn. She waited. I want you to know that I understand what you're doing here. He said it carefully, with the slightly labored quality of someone who doesn't say things like this often and is determined to say it right. What you've done. The buyer, the bank, the survey. When Sadie brought you here, I thought it was a bad idea, and I was rude about it. You were wary, she said. It was reasonable. I was rude, he said, with the mild firmness of someone correcting the record. And I want you to know I've noticed the difference. What you've done for this place. For Sadie. He stopped. He clearly had more he'd intended to say, and had run into the wall he always ran into when he tried to say things that went past the immediate and practical. That's all, he said. She didn't know quite what to do with it, which was its own kind of information. She said thank you, and meant it, and went back to her notebook, and he went to pour himself water and stood at the window for a while in the dark before going upstairs. She was still at the table at midnight when she heard the sound, low and wrong, and in the direction of the barn, a sound that didn't fit the night. She was at the door before she'd fully decided to move, and when she stepped onto the porch, she smelled it before she saw it. Smoke, and below it, already, the first ugly orange light climbing the side of the barn wall, moving the way fire moves when it's been helped, fast and deliberate and hungry. She screamed for Cole. She screamed for Hector, and she ran. The barn didn't burn down. That was the first thing. The thing that mattered more than everything that came after it in the immediate hours, though in the days that followed, it was easy to forget how close it had been. Evelyn reached the barn door before Cole did, by maybe 30 seconds, and she got the latch up and threw the door wide and went in the way you go into a burning building when there are animals inside and you have not yet had time to be afraid. The south wall was the one burning, fire climbing the exterior boards and already eating through at one point near the roofline. But the interior was still mostly smoke rather than flame, and the horses were screaming in the way horses scream, which is one of the worst sounds a human being can be near. And she went to the nearest stall and got the animal out by main force, half blind from the smoke, and got it through the barn door into the yard. Cole was there by then, and Hector, and Pete, and Birch, coming at a run from the bunkhouse. They got the horses out, 7 of them, all terrified, all requiring more managing than they had hands for. The 2 milk cows from the smaller stall at the back, the tack room contents they couldn't save, and 2 months of feed stored against the south wall that the fire ate before they could do anything about it. Sheriff Henderson arrived an hour later, by which time they had the fire under control with a bucket line from the water trough. And the south wall was mostly gone, and the roof above it had partially caved, but the barn's main structure stood. Henderson walked the perimeter and looked at the burn pattern and asked his questions in the careful, methodical way of a man who doesn't say anything he doesn't mean. Accelerant, he said, not to anyone in particular. It wasn't a question. The pattern on the baseboards, Evelyn said. He looked at her. You know fire. I know what fire that moves that fast from a single point looks like compared to what it looks like when it spreads on its own. He didn't argue. He wrote in his notebook for a moment. You have thoughts on who might have an interest in causing this kind of damage. Cole told him about the fence cutting, about the Crest Fork cattle, about Blackwell's visit and Cross's letter. He told it in the flat, sequential way he told everything, and Henderson listened without interrupting. When Cole finished, Henderson was quiet for a moment. I can't prove any of that connects to tonight, he said. I know you can't, Evelyn said. Not yet. We're not asking you to prove it tonight. We're asking you to have it on the record. Henderson looked at her again. He was a man in his mid-50s, broad through the chest, with a gray mustache, and the steady, slightly sorrowful eyes of someone who has seen enough human behavior not to be shocked by most of it. You're the woman who came in on the October train, he said. I am. Heard you've been helping Walker with the ranch business. Yes. Heard you've been making things uncomfortable for some people who preferred things uncomfortable for him. That's a fair description, she said. He wrote something else in his notebook. I'll look into the accelerant question and what I can do with it. He closed the notebook. Walker, I'm sorry about your barn. We'll rebuild it, Cole said. He was looking at the damaged wall and his voice was steady in a way that cost him something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the muscle working in his jaw. 2 years of holding things together against a slow collapse, and now this. But the steadiness was real. He had made a decision somewhere in the middle of the fire, and it was visible in him. Yes, she said, we will. The morning after this fire, Evelyn drove herself to town. She had not slept. She had spent the dark hours after Henderson left sitting with Sadie, who had come out of the house during the fire and seen enough of it to be frightened but had refused to go back inside until the last of the flame was out. The girl had not cried. She'd sat on the porch step with her knees pulled up and watched the men work, and when Evelyn had come and sat beside her, Sadie had said, without looking at her, "They're trying to make us leave." "Yes," Evelyn had said. She hadn't softened it. "Are we going to leave?" "No." Sadie had leaned slightly, almost imperceptibly, against Evelyn's arm. "Not much. Just enough." Now Evelyn drove into Black Ridge in the gray early morning, and she was angry. Not the hot, reactive kind of anger that makes people say the wrong thing, but the cold, precise kind that sharpens everything down to what matters. She had been in situations before where the answer was to get small and quiet and wait for things to improve. She had decided, sometime in the smoke and the bucket line and the screaming horses of the previous night, that this was not one of those situations. Her first stop was the general store, which was the closest thing Black Ridge had to a public forum. Owen Marsh ran the store, a man of about 50 with a careful, watchful quality that she had initially read as unfriendly and had since understood was simply how he processed the world before he committed to anything. He was behind the counter when she came in, which meant he had heard the news because Owen Marsh was behind the counter by 6 in the morning every morning, and people with news came to him. "Heard about the barn," he said. "Then I won't waste time with the background," she said. "I need to talk to you about something." He waited. She laid out what she knew about Blackwell and Cross, not as rumors, not as suspicions, but as a documented sequence of events with dates and specifics. The fence cutting, the Crest Fork cattle on Walker land, the boundary survey question that Cross had raised and that they had already answered with the 1879 document, the pattern of Cross's activity in other territories, which she had now confirmed through correspondence, and the fire, with Henderson's assessment of accelerant. Owen listened without interrupting. He was very still in the way that certain people are still when they are taking in information they intend to use. When she finished, he said, "What do you want from me?" "I want you to know the truth," she said, "because when Blackwell or Cross comes into your store, and they will, they'll have a version of events. I want you to have already heard the other one. And if there are people in this town who have had dealings with Blackwell to contracts, purchases, promises, I'd like to know about them. Because in the other territories where Cross operated, the pattern included pressuring local businesses as well as the property owners. Owen was quiet for a moment. He looked at the counter and then at her. Blackwell's had a hold on some of the supply contracts for the farms east of here, he said. 3 farms that I used to supply. He recommended his own man for the supply work when those farms came into his portfolio. Did they come into his portfolio willingly? Owen's expression gave her the answer before he said, Henderson Evans, not the sheriff, different man, lost his north section in a boundary dispute 3 years ago. Dispute was managed by a legal firm out of the capital. Firm had 2 partners. One of them was named Cross. She felt the cold, sharp focus of that. Do you know where Henderson Evans is now? Moved his family to Mill Haven, couldn't make a go of it after the land sale. I need to speak to him, she said. Can you give me a letter of introduction? Owen looked at her for a long moment. You're building a file, he said. Yes. On Blackwell and Cross. Yes. He picked up the pen he kept beside the counter ledger and pulled a sheet of paper toward him. I'll write you the letter, he said. And I'll tell you something else for free. I'm not the only man in this town who's been watching what Blackwell does to properties in this territory. I've been watching it for 2 years and not doing anything about it because there wasn't a clear enough picture. He looked up from the paper. You're starting to give it a picture. She left the store with the letter and 3 names she hadn't had before. Oh, what happened over the next 10 days was the kind of thing that is difficult to organize and impossible to predict and looks, in retrospect, more coherent than it felt while it was happening. Birch made the ride to Millhaven and came back with a written statement from Henderson Evans about the boundary dispute, the Cross firm's involvement, and the below-market price at which he'd been compelled to sell. The statement was specific, dated, and signed. Evelyn wrote to 2 contacts in other territories whose names she had found through her earlier research, people who had been through Cross's method before, and received, within the week, 2 letters confirming the pattern with enough detail to constitute independent corroboration. Owen Marsh, without being asked to do anything beyond what he'd offered, mentioned what he knew to the 3 other storekeepers on Black Ridge's main street. By the end of that week, 2 of them had independently recalled interactions with Blackwell's people that had carried the same pressure and misdirection she'd described. The Reverend's wife, a woman named Clara Potts, who had no connection to the church's business interests and considerable connection to everyone else's, mentioned at the Thursday gathering of the Women's Sewing Circle that the Walker barn fire was likely not an accident, and that the Walker Ranch had been managing its affairs quite well lately, despite certain people's efforts to prevent it. Clara Potts was not someone whose opinions circulated slowly. Sheriff Henderson, for his part, said nothing publicly that he couldn't prove, but he made a point of walking past the Double W property twice in 1 week, which, in a settlement of Black Ridge's size, was its own kind of statement. Evelyn did not orchestrate all of this. She couldn't have, even if she'd tried. What she had done was start it, put facts in front of people who had been watching and waiting without a clear enough picture, and the rest had moved on its own, the way things move in small communities when the direction is finally clear. People in Black Ridge were not naive. They had been watching Victor Blackwell acquire property and push out neighbors for 2 years, and what they had lacked was not will, but the particular form of organized information that turns private suspicion into collective action. She saw it in the barn. Cole had announced the day after the fire that he was going to rebuild. He had not asked for help. He had stated it the way he stated things, flat and final. And Evelyn had understood that he said it that way because asking for help was something he still did not know how to do. 3 days later, on a Saturday, Owen Marsh showed up with lumber that he said he'd be crediting to a store account that could be settled when the cattle sale funds cleared. Behind him came 2 men from neighboring farms and the blacksmith, and a man whose name Evelyn didn't know who turned out to be Lawrence Tate's eldest son. And by mid-morning, there were 11 people working on the barn frame, and Sadie was carrying water and sandwiches with the efficient purposefulness of someone who finally had a job that matched her capacity. Cole stood in the yard and watched them come, and his face did something that he turned away before most people could see. Evelyn saw it. She went to stand beside him and said nothing, which was the right thing. I don't know why they came, he said quietly. Not confused, something more complicated than confused. Because you've been here 11 years, and you've never asked anyone for anything, she said. And because people understand when they finally see the full picture, what it means to watch someone fight alone. He said nothing for a moment. You gave them the picture. I gave them information, she said. They made their own choices. He looked at the frame going up. The sound of hammers, the smell of new wood, birch up on the beam with a confidence that someone his age shouldn't have had and clearly did. Then he looked at her. You've been doing that since you got here yet, he said. Giving people information and letting them make choices. It's what works, she said. It's also generous. He said it simply, without the slightly labored quality she'd noticed before when he tried to say something personal. It was just a fact he was stating, especially for someone who didn't have to stay. She looked at the barn frame and thought about Cincinnati, about the narrow apartment with its bad window, about the train ride out here with the hope she'd been carrying like something fragile, about the bench at the Black Ridge Depot and the $43 and the dog that had fallen asleep beside her. I had nowhere else to go, she said. At first, he said. She thought about that. At first, she agreed. 10. The legal assault came 11 days after the fire, and it came in the form Cross was best at. Paperwork, delivered on a Tuesday morning by a man who wasn't Cross himself, but who carried Cross's letterhead and Cross's precision. The document was a civil claim. It alleged that Evelyn Harper, operating without legal standing as a representative of the Double W Ranch, had entered into business agreements on Cole Walker's behalf without proper authorization, and that those agreements, specifically the Garner sale and the Tate renewal, were therefore legally questionable. It further alleged, in language that was careful and technically intricate, that Evelyn's presence on the property and her role in its management constituted grounds for a separate claim that Cross, acting on behalf of a client, intended to pursue in the territorial court. The separate claim was the piece that took a moment to fully parse. Cole read it 3 times, and his expression went through several things it rarely went through. Evelyn read it once and understood it immediately, which made her stomach drop in a way she controlled before it showed. Cross was claiming, on behalf of Damian Cross personally, not Blackwell, not a corporate entity, but Cross himself, that Evelyn's circumstances on the ranch constituted a form of domestic arrangement that entitled him, under a specific and narrow provision of territorial law that was rarely invoked and almost never successfully, to petition for her removal from the property to a supervised arrangement pending her establishment of independent legal status. It was, in plain language, a claim that she belonged somewhere else, and that Cross had the right to determine where. That's not a real legal argument, she said. She kept her voice flat. He's not making it because it's going to win, Cole said. His voice was quiet in a way that was more alarming than if he'd shouted. He's making it to tie us up, to cost us time and money on a legal defense while he and Blackwell work the other angle. Yes. And to threaten you. He looked at her directly. Specifically, you. Yes. The room was very quiet. Outside, Sadie was doing something at the water pump, the sound of it carrying in the thin November air. I'm not going to let that stand, Cole said. I know. We need a lawyer. I know a man in Harlow, practiced for 30 years. His name is Samuel Cord. He's not cheap. How not cheap? The Garner sale gives us enough to cover it if we're careful. She nodded. Then we go to Harlow this week. He was still looking at her, and the look had something in it that she hadn't seen from him before, or hadn't let herself identify before now. Not concern, exactly. Not gratitude. Something more settled than either of those things, and more specific. Evelyn, he said, I need to say something first. She waited. He stood up from the table and he looked at the window and then back at her, and he had the slightly uncomfortable quality of a man who has decided to say a thing he's been deciding not to say for long enough that the deciding not to has become a habit. I've been watching you for 6 weeks, he said. Watching what you do and how you do it, and who you are when things go bad. I know that's not the same as knowing someone. I know you came here under circumstances that had nothing to do with me, and that you stayed because the options were limited, and I didn't make it particularly easy for you to want to. He stopped. He looked at the table. But I'm asking you to marry me. The silence that followed was the complete kind. Not because of the legal situation, he said. I want to be clear about that. The legal situation is a reason to do it quickly, if you say yes. It's not the reason I'm asking. He looked back at her. I'm asking because I don't want you to leave. I'm asking because whatever this place has become in the last 6 weeks, it's partly because of you, and I don't know how to separate those things anymore. She sat with it. She sat with the whole weight of it, the unexpectedness, and also the fact that it wasn't entirely unexpected, which was its own complicated thing. Cole, she said. You can say no, he said. I mean that. Nothing changes if you say no. Things would change, she said. Then yes, they would. He was looking at her steadily. But I'd rather have asked and have things change than not ask and have the situation decide for me. She thought about Gerald Holt and the letters she'd believed in. She thought about what it meant to come to a place with nothing and start building something from the ground up, and at what point the building became more than a practical exercise. She thought about Sadie, braiding her own hair badly in the morning because there was no one to do it, and what it meant that there was someone to do it now. I have nothing to bring to this, she said. No money, no property, no connections. I came here with $43 and someone else's bad intentions. I know what you came here with, he said. I also know what you've done since. She looked at him for a long moment. The November light was coming in flat and gray through the window, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man who worked too hard and didn't talk enough, and was learning, imperfectly, how to ask for what he needed. She thought, I have been harder to get to know than that, and he got here anyway. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. Not dramatically, just the breath of someone who had been holding something. All right, he said. We go to Harlow on Thursday. We see Cord about the legal situation, and we find a justice of the peace while we're there. In that order, she said. In that order, he agreed. Bond. Samuel Cord was everything Cole had described. A man of 70 with the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had been practicing law long enough to know which urgencies were real and which were theater. He read Cross's claim and Henderson Evans's statement and Evelyn's collected correspondence from the other territories. And then he took off his glasses and set them on his desk and said, This is a man who has done this before and not been held accountable for it. 3 times that I can document, Evelyn said. Possibly more. The domestic arrangement claim is garbage, Cord said. I don't say that as an opinion. I say it as someone who has read the provision he's citing, and it doesn't apply here under any reasonable reading. He knows it doesn't apply. It's designed to occupy time. He tapped the Evans statement. This, on the other hand, is useful. Combined with your letters from the other territories, we have the beginning of a pattern claim, and a pattern claim against a licensed attorney has specific consequences. Disbarment? Cole asked. Potentially. More immediately, sanctions from the territorial court and the kind of judicial attention that makes his current claims harder to pursue. Cord put his glasses back on. I can file a response to the domestic claim this week that will shut it down inside 30 days. The larger question, building the case that Cross has operated fraudulently as a pattern, that takes longer, months possibly. We may not have months, Evelyn said. Blackwell is going to move on the property again. What form do you expect it to take? He's lost the boundary angle. The arson was a mistake because it brought Henderson in and didn't accomplish what he needed. I think he goes back to financial pressure, tries to find a creditor or create one. Cord looked at her steadily. You think like a lawyer. I think like someone who's been watching him work, she said. Same thing, in practice. He made a note. I'll draft an injunction filing that puts the court on notice about the pattern of behavior. It won't stop him, but it will slow him down and make him more visible. Visible men make mistakes. They left Cord's office with a plan and a retainer figure that was substantial but survivable, and found the justice of the peace on the same afternoon, in an office above the hardware store, and were married in a proceeding that took 12 minutes and involved a great deal of paper and very little ceremony. Evelyn had not expected ceremony, and Cole had not offered it, and the 12 minutes were real in a way that ceremony might not have been. On the drive back, she sat beside him on the wagon seat with the marriage certificate folded in her coat pocket and thought about all the things that had happened since the October train and where those things had brought her, and she couldn't quite make the shape of it resolve into something simple. You're quiet, Cole said. I'm always quiet on long drives, she said. That's not true. She looked at him. He was watching the road with the slight half-attention of someone who knows a route well. No, she said. It's not. She looked back at the road. I'm thinking about what Cord said, about Cross making mistakes when he's visible. You want to make him more visible. I want the town to know what the court filing says. She turned it over. Not as gossip, as information, the same way Owen Marsh knew. Cole nodded slowly. Henderson would post a public notice if Cord sends the filing directly to him. Would he? If I asked him. Ask him, she said. He nodded again. The road ran out ahead of them toward Black Ridge and the Double W, and the light was going fast the way it went in November. And the cold was the serious kind now, the kind that meant winter was not a threat any longer, but a fact. Cole, she said, what you said this morning, before Cord, about the ranch being partly because of me. She stopped and started again. I want you to know that's... The ranch was here before me. What you built, what you held on to when it would have been easier not to. I didn't make this place. I helped it, maybe, but you made it. He was quiet for a moment, then, Margaret would have said we both made it. It was the first time he'd mentioned Margaret's name without the slight withdrawal that usually followed it. Evelyn heard the difference. She sounds like she was right about most things, she said. She was, he said. She also would have told me much earlier to ask for help when I needed it. He glanced at her briefly. So, she said. The wagon rolled on through the November dark, and behind them the county seat of Harlow faded, and ahead of them the Double W waited, and Cross was not finished, and Blackwell was not finished, and the court filing had not yet been served, and there was still winter to get through, and a cattle delivery to complete, and a barn that was only half rebuilt. None of that had changed, but something else had, and Evelyn sat with the marriage certificate in her pocket and the cold air on her face and thought, this is what it feels like when a thing becomes yours. Not clean, not simple, not the way you imagined it, but yours all the same. The court filing landed on a Wednesday. Samuel Cord had moved faster than Evelyn expected. She had anticipated 10 days, and he delivered in 6, which she later understood was his way of telling her he took the case seriously. The filing went to the territorial court in the capital, and a copy went to Sheriff Henderson, who posted the public notice the following morning on the board outside his office, the way Cole had asked him to. By noon that day, every person in Black Ridge who walked past the sheriff's office had seen it, which was most of them, because that was the kind of town it was. The notice did not editorialize. It didn't need to. It named Damian Cross. It named the case numbers from the 2 other territories where his conduct had been formally questioned, and it described in plain language the pattern that Cord's filing alleged. Evelyn had helped Cord draft the language of that section, and she had been careful to keep it factual rather than incendiary, because she had understood since her first conversation with Owen Marsh that facts are more durable than outrage. Outrage fades when people get tired of being angry. Facts stay on the record. Cross came to find her the same afternoon. She was at the Marsh General Store when he walked in, and she knew from the way Owen straightened behind the counter that he'd seen Cross come through the door. Cross looked at her with an expression that had finally dropped the pleasant professional mask. Not threatening, exactly, but honest in a way his pleasantness had never been. She found she preferred it. The filing is a tactic, he said. He didn't bother with preamble. Most legal documents are, she said. It won't survive a motion to dismiss. Mr. Cord believes it will. I trust Mr. Cord's judgment on matters of territorial law. She picked up the tin of coffee she'd been examining and turned it in her hands. Was there something specific you wanted to discuss? You're going to cost your husband more in legal fees than this property is worth. He said husband with the slight pause of someone acknowledging a situation they hadn't anticipated and resent. That's an interesting calculation from a man who's been costing Victor Blackwell money for 2 years with nothing to show for it, she said. The ranch is still there. The Garner delivery completed on schedule. The bank restructuring holds, the Tate agreement holds, the barn is being rebuilt. She set the coffee tin down. What exactly has your method accomplished here? His jaw tightened barely. She would have missed it a few months ago. You think you've won something. I think you should speak to a territorial attorney who isn't yourself about what's on that courthouse board, she said. And I think you should consider that the people in this room and the 4 people who've walked past that board today and come in here to mention it are not going to forget which side of this you've been on. Owen Marsh, behind the counter, was examining a ledger with such intense concentration that it was almost funny. Cross looked at her for a moment longer, then he turned and walked out. She bought the coffee and 2 other things she needed and didn't let herself feel anything about what had just happened until she was back in the wagon and heading out of town. And then she let herself feel it for exactly as long as the drive home required, which was enough. Chat. The Garner delivery had completed 4 days before the court filing, and Evelyn had been there for every hour of it. Getting 112 head of cattle 60 miles to Millhaven in November was not a comfortable enterprise. It was 3 days of cold riding, difficult terrain in the last section, and one genuinely bad afternoon when a section of the herd spooked near a creek crossing and scattered in a direction that cost them 2 hours they didn't have. Hector managed that situation with the particular calm of a man who has managed worse, and Cole rode into the middle of it in a way that Evelyn watched from the ridge above and thought, this is what he's for. This is where he makes sense. She had driven the supply wagon with Birch and handled the logistics of the stops, the water, the timing. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that becomes invisible when it goes right and catastrophic when it doesn't, and she made it go right by checking every detail twice and not sleeping much and knowing exactly where they needed to be at what hour. Garner met them at the Millhaven yards on the 3rd afternoon and counted the herd himself, which she had expected, and found the count accurate, which she had ensured. He wrote the draft on the spot, and on the drive back she held it in her coat pocket the same way she'd held the marriage certificate 2 weeks before, as a piece of paper that was also a proof of something. Back at the Double W, she sat down with Cole and went through the numbers with the care of someone who has learned that good news deserves the same precision as bad. The Garner payment covered Cord's retainer with enough left to pay Hector, Pete, and Birch the full amount of the wages outstanding since August, settle the second loan's November payment, and leave a working balance that was not comfortable but was real. When she told Cole the wage number, he went quiet in a way that said he was adding the months in his head. They waited a long time, he said. They did. I need to talk to them myself. I know, she said. I wasn't going to do that for you. He went to find Hector, and she stayed at the table, and she could hear the conversation happening outside through the window she'd cracked for air. Not the words, just the register of it. Cole's voice lower than usual and Hector's brief, and then a pause. And then what might have been Hector saying something in Spanish, which he did when he was moved and didn't want to show it too directly. When Cole came back inside, he went directly to pour himself water and stood at the counter with his back to her for a moment. She said nothing. There are things that don't need witnessing. Holtz. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of December. Cord had pushed for the earliest available date, and the territorial court had accommodated because Cross's filing, the domestic arrangement claim against Evelyn, had attracted the attention of the circuit judge in a way that suggested the court was not inclined to spend its calendar on what it had clearly already identified as a vexatious action. Evelyn learned this from Cord in a letter that used careful legal language, but the implication was clear enough. Cross was in trouble. Not yet finished, but in trouble. What complicated the weeks before the hearing was Blackwell. He had been quiet since the barn. Too quiet, in the way that certain kinds of men are quiet when they are reassessing rather than retreating. Evelyn had not made the mistake of reading his silence as withdrawal. She had spent those weeks continuing to build the documentation file, continuing to correspond with the territorial contacts, and making sure that Sheriff Henderson had everything she had at every point she got it. Henderson, for his part, had been doing his own work. He told her this in one of the quiet conversations they developed the habit of having when she came to town. Standing on the board sidewalk outside his office, speaking in the low, careful tone of a man who measured every word against what he could prove. He had found, through his own channels, a witness to the barn fire. Not a witness who had seen it set. A witness who had seen 2 men on horseback leaving the Double W road at approximately the time the fire started, riding in the direction of Blackwell's Crest Fork property. I can't prove who they were, Henderson said. Not yet. but I know who they work for. Is that enough for the court? Not for criminal charges. Not today. He looked at the courthouse board where the filing notice was still posted and had not been taken down. But combined with the Evans statement and your correspondence, and with what Cord is putting in front of the circuit judge, it starts to look like the kind of picture that makes people in positions of authority ask questions they haven't been asked to ask. Blackwell has connections, she said. He does. So does the railroad, and the railroad has been losing property acquisition opportunities in this county for 2 years because Blackwell has been outmaneuvering them. The railroad's lawyers are not small. He looked at her. I made a quiet inquiry. She understood what he was telling her. Blackwell had made enemies outside Black Ridge who had more resources than she did, and Henderson had made sure those enemies knew there was now a documented legal record of Blackwell's methods. She felt the careful brilliance of that. Not something she had orchestrated, but something that had grown from the information she'd put into circulation. You've been working this longer than I thought, she said. 2 years, he said. I just didn't have the pieces organized. He picked up the coffee cup he'd carried out with him. You organized them. Thus, the December hearing was held in the county seat of Harlow, in the same courthouse where the original land grant records were filed, which Evelyn found fitting in a way she didn't say out loud. She and Cole drove up the night before and stayed at a boarding house on the main street, separate rooms, which led to a brief, awkward moment at the desk that they both handled by pretending it hadn't happened, which was its own form of marital negotiation. Cord met them at the courthouse the following morning in a coat that was colder weather appropriate and an expression that was controlled and therefore probably positive. The judge has already reviewed the filings, he said. She's not pleased with how the domestic claim was constructed. She, Evelyn said, Judge Marin Halcott, appointed 3 years ago. Cord's expression allowed itself a small dryness. She wrote her own annotated response to the provision cross-cited. In her notes, she described his reading of it as imaginative. Cole made a sound that might have been a laugh briefly. The courtroom was not large, and it was cold, with a stove at the back that was working on the problem without having solved it. Cross was already seated at the respondent's table with a younger attorney beside him, whom Evelyn didn't recognize. He did not look at her when she came in, which she read as a man who had decided that acknowledging her presence cost him something. Blackwell was not there. She had not expected him to be. Judge Halcott was a woman in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular quality of attention that some people develop when they have been required to listen carefully for decades and have learned that most people don't say what they mean until the third time they say it. She read the room when she entered without appearing to, and she moved through the procedural opening with practiced speed. Cross's attorney argued the domestic claim with a professionalism that Evelyn respected in the abstract. He was making the best case available for a weak position, which was his job, and he did it without embarrassing himself. He cited the provision. He argued the application. He described Evelyn's situation on the ranch in terms that were technically accurate and contextually dishonest. Cord responded with 12 minutes of precisely structured argument that included the Evans statement, the 2 territorial letters, and a summary of the barn fire's circumstances that stopped short of direct accusation while leaving nothing to the imagination. He then addressed the domestic provision directly and took it apart with the efficient calm of a man who has been waiting for 30 years to demolish exactly this kind of argument. Judge Halcott asked 4 questions. 2 were directed at Cross's attorney, and his answers were careful but insufficient. 2 were directed at Cord, and his answers were complete. She recessed for 40 minutes. Evelyn sat in the hallway with Cole on a wooden bench that was the twin of the bench at the Black Ridge Depot where she'd sat in October with $43 and a dog asleep beside her. She thought about that bench and this one, and the distance between them, which was not entirely measured in miles. You're not worried, Cole said. I'm always worried, she said. I'm just not showing it. Cord looked confident. Cord always looks confident. That's part of what you're paying for. He was quiet for a moment. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, turned slightly toward her, and she had learned in the past weeks what that posture meant. It was the posture of a man who was present, fully, in the way that he sometimes wasn't when things were easier. Difficulty made him pay attention, which was not the worst quality in a person to be bound to. Whatever happens in there, he said. Cole, I'm serious. I know you're serious. Whatever happens in there, we go home and we figure out the next thing. She looked at him. That's all this is. The next thing. He held her gaze for a moment, and something in his face settled into the particular kind of quiet that means a person has located their footing. All right, he said. They went back in when the bailiff called them. Judge Halcott's ruling on the domestic claim was 4 sentences, and the first sentence was dismissed. The remaining 3 sentences addressed the frivolous nature of the application and placed a formal notation in Cross's professional record with the Territorial Bar Association. She then requested that Cord submit the full pattern documentation within 15 days for her review in connection with a separate inquiry she was opening on her own initiative. Cross stood very still at his table while this was read. His attorney made a note. Cross himself did not write anything. Outside the courthouse, in the cold December air, Cord shook both their hands and permitted himself the full version of the smile he'd been restraining all morning. The separate inquiry is what matters most, he said. That's the judge deciding she's going to look at this regardless of what anyone files. That's the beginning of the end of Mr. Cross's ability to operate in this territory. And Blackwell? Cole asked. The inquiry will look at the relationships between the parties. Blackwell's name is in the documentation. Cord picked up his briefcase. He'll know that by the end of the day. Men who know they're being looked at change their behavior, usually in ways that confirm what you already suspected. He went back inside to file additional paperwork, and Cole and Evelyn stood on the courthouse steps in the cold, and Evelyn looked at the street of Harlow, the storefronts, the wagons, the ordinary machinery of a county seat going about its Wednesday, and felt something she had difficulty naming precisely. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something more like the feeling of having carried something heavy for a long time and being allowed finally to set it down without being sure you're done walking. We should start back, Cole said. Yes. She didn't move immediately. Cole, do you remember what you said to me? The morning after the fire. You said you weren't going to let it stand. I remember. You meant it about more than the legal claim. He looked at her steadily. Yes. I know. She started down the steps. I just wanted to say that I knew that. At the time. He fell into step beside her, and they walked to where the wagon was hitched, and the drive home began in the kind of quiet that is not empty. Victor Blackwell left the territory in February. He did not leave quietly, and he did not leave entirely by choice. The judge's separate inquiry had expanded, by the new year, to encompass 3 property transactions in the county that now had formal questions attached to them, and the railroad's lawyers had indeed become interested. And the combination of those 2 forces applied to a man who had built his operation on the assumption that no one would ever organize the documentation properly turned out to be more than his patience could sustain. He sold the Crest Fork property to a farming consortium from the east and was gone by the 2nd week of the month. Evelyn heard about it from Owen Marsh, who heard it from Henderson, who had watched Blackwell's wagon leave the Crest Fork Road with the studied neutrality of a man who had wanted to watch that for 2 years. Owen told her in the store on a Thursday afternoon, with the particular restraint of someone who wanted to say a great deal more than they were saying. That's good news, she said. It is, Owen said, and then, abandoning restraint, it's very good news. She allowed herself a moment of something that was probably satisfaction, and then went back to the supply order she'd been working on. Cross had been gone since January. He had left Black Ridge within a week of the court ruling, which was about what she'd expected, and his departure from the territory followed 2 months later when the Bar Association's review found sufficient basis to suspend his license pending further inquiry. She learned this in a letter from Cord that was written in the measured language of a man who had been doing this work for a long time and knew that most victories are partial and most endings are untidy, but who could not quite suppress, in the final paragraph, the observation that this particular outcome was, in his view, just. She agreed with him. She also knew that somewhere, in some other territory, someone else was probably receiving careful letters from a man with a good coat who had found a new name to operate under. The world was not fixed. The work was not done. What was done was this, here, now, and that had to be enough, because it was what there was. Spring came late that year, the way spring comes late after a hard winter. Reluctantly, by degrees, as if it wasn't sure the cold was done with the land and wanted to confirm before committing. The barn was finished by the end of February. Cole and Hector and Pete and Birch had kept at it through the worst of January, working in the cold with a consistency that Evelyn had watched through the kitchen window and thought, "This is what it looks like when people decide they're not going to be moved." The structure was better than what had burned, not because they had more money or more time, but because Hector had opinions about the roofline, and Owen Marsh had thrown in better lumber than what they'd originally budgeted for, and because when people build something after it's been destroyed, they tend to build it more deliberately than the first time. There's an anger in it that becomes care. Sadie had named it the first morning they opened the new barn doors. The second one, she said, which was not a poetic name but was an honest one, and it stuck. Lawrence Tate came by in March to inspect the spring calves as agreed and found them in better condition than he'd anticipated, and signed the spring sale agreement on the Walker kitchen table with the brisk efficiency of a man who has confirmed what he needed to confirm and is ready to move on. As he was leaving, he paused on the porch and looked out at the yard. The rebuilt barn, the fence line in good repair, the evidence everywhere of a place being actively managed rather than slowly abandoned. "You've done well here," he said. He said it to both of them, which Evelyn noted. "We're not done," Cole said. "No," Tate agreed. "But you've done well." It was a simple thing, and it shouldn't have mattered much, and it mattered more than it should have, which was its own kind of information about the previous year. Evelyn wrote to the territorial authorities about Gerald Holt that spring, the man who had never existed, or rather, the man or men who had assembled an identity and correspondence for the purpose of taking money from women who were trying to find a way out of lives that had run out of room. She had written once before, in October, and received an acknowledgement. This time she sent everything: copies of the letters, the timeline, the money transfer, a detailed account of the method used. She did not expect a resolution. She expected the record to exist, which was not the same thing but was not nothing. She thought sometimes about the other women who had received letters from Gerald Holt, or from whoever Gerald Holt had been, whether they had sent money, whether they had made the train ride, whether they had arrived at a depot somewhere and found an empty platform and understood, in that specific and terrible way, that the hope they'd carried was a construction built specifically to take something from them. She couldn't reach those women. She couldn't undo what had happened to them. What she could do was make sure the record existed, and go on, and do the work. That was, she had come to understand, most of what life actually asked, not grand resolution, not the clean satisfaction of a story that ties itself in a bow, but the daily choice to go on and do the work in front of you. The meaning didn't announce itself. It accumulated, the way interest accumulates, in increments small enough that on any given day you could be forgiven for not noticing. Cole was different by summer. Not transformed. She would not have trusted transformed. It would have felt like a lie, like a story that was too clean. But different in the way that people are different when they've been carrying something alone for so long that they've forgotten what it feels like to share the weight, and then they remember. He laughed more, not often, but more. He had conversations with Hector that were actual conversations and not just the exchange of operational information. He asked Sadie questions about her schoolwork that showed he'd been listening to her answers from previous questions, which was its own kind of change. He was not easy. He still had the quality of a man who went silent when he was struggling rather than toward someone. And there were evenings when the silence at the kitchen table was the working kind and not the restful kind. She had learned the difference, and she had learned not to push through it prematurely. She had her own version of this, her own tendency to manage things internally until they were fully formed, to present conclusions rather than process, which was efficient and occasionally isolating. They were two people who had each learned through necessity to need very little, and who were now in the slow, imperfect work of learning to need each other. Sadie watched this process with the observant quiet of a child who has been paying attention to adults far longer than she should have had to. She was 12 by summer, taller, with her braids done neatly every morning in the kitchen, the way they'd been done since October. She was learning to ride properly, Cole teaching her on Sunday mornings when the week's work allowed it. And she had opinions about the cattle management that Hector sometimes solicited and sometimes wished he hadn't. She was, Evelyn thought, going to be formidable. And the only question was in what direction, which was an interesting question to watch develop in real time. One afternoon in late June, Sadie found Evelyn in the small room off the kitchen that had become her working space. Desk, ledgers, the correspondence files, the running accounts that she now maintained with the same precision Margaret had brought to them, and perhaps a different kind, her own kind, built from different experience and different priorities. Sadie sat on the edge of the desk without asking permission and looked at the papers spread across it. "I want to learn this," she said. "The accounts? All of it. What you do, the numbers and the letters and the negotiating and all of it." Evelyn looked at her. "You're 12. I know how old I am. You'll have years to—" "I want to start now," Sadie said. "My mother knew how to do it. She never taught me because she thought she had more time." The directness of that, the absence of performance in it, was characteristic. Sadie had never learned to be indirect about what she meant, and Evelyn had stopped expecting her to. "I don't want to wait until I need it." It was, Evelyn thought, one of the wisest things she'd heard from someone of any age. The lesson that circumstances were trying to teach everyone around her said that preparation is not pessimism, that the skills you need in a crisis are the ones you have to build before the crisis, coming out of the mouth of a 12-year-old who had learned it from watching what happens when you don't. "All right," she said. "We start Monday." Sadie nodded, satisfied, and got off the desk and went back outside, and Evelyn sat for a moment looking at the door she'd left through and thinking about all the things that had been different a year ago and what the shape of that difference was and whether it had a name. Well, what she had come here with was nothing. That was the truth, plainly stated, and she had never been someone who benefited from softening plain truths. She had come here with a fraudulent promise and $43 and 2 battered bags and the particular desperate courage of a person who has run out of acceptable options. She had not come here looking for meaning. She had come here looking for a way to survive, which is not the same thing, and is also, sometimes, how meaning actually arrives. Sideways, uninvited, while you're doing something else entirely. The lesson, if there was one, was not that courage is always rewarded, because it isn't. She knew that, had watched it not be rewarded for the women who had written to Gerald Holt and never found what she had found. The lesson was not that love fixes things, because it doesn't, not by itself, not without the daily work of two people who are each imperfect and sometimes stubborn and occasionally wrong. The lesson was not even that justice prevails, because it prevails partially and unevenly, and often slowly, and sometimes not at all. And anyone who tells you different is selling you the same thing Gerald Holt was selling. What she had found, what she had built, alongside Cole and Sadie and Hector and Owen Marsh and Henderson and all the unremarkable, complicated, imperfect people who had shown up when it mattered, was something more durable than any of the things she'd come here looking for. She had found that the worst thing that ever happened to her had put her exactly where she needed to be. Not because the universe was tidy, or because she deserved it, or because some invisible hand had arranged it to work out, but because she had not stopped moving when the ground disappeared under her. She had sat on a bench at the Black Ridge Depot with nothing, and she had made a list, and she had taken the next step, and then the next. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those next steps, something had become hers that nothing could fully take away. That was the only thing she knew, with any certainty, about how to live. Keep the list, take the next step. And don't make the mistake of needing the story to be clean before you're willing to believe it's real. Years later, 6 years, maybe 7, time having the quality on a working ranch of flowing faster than you track it, there were more people at the Double W kitchen table than it had been built to hold, and no one had gotten around to building a bigger one because there was always something else that needed doing first. Sadie was 18 and had opinions about the cattle breeding program that Cole now solicited without reservation and sometimes adopted over his own initial judgment, which was its own evolution. She had been keeping the ranch accounts with Evelyn since she was 12 and had long since surpassed simple competence, developing a particular instinct for market timing that Evelyn recognized as something beyond what she'd taught her. Something native, something Sadie had been born with and would have eventually found regardless, and that had simply been given a direction. Hector had stayed. His 60-day evaluation had apparently renewed silently, year after year, in the way that certain decisions remake themselves without requiring revisitation. Pete had moved on, eventually, to a ranch of his own in a valley 2 counties east. He'd saved his wages and bought a small claim, which was the kind of thing Evelyn had made possible by actually paying those wages, though she didn't take credit for the decision he'd made with the money. Birch was still there, older and more capable in every direction, occasionally alarming in his willingness to attempt structural repairs without consulting anyone first. The ranch was not wealthy. That was the truth, and Evelyn had no interest in pretending otherwise. It was stable, which was different, and stable was what they had built, and stability was harder and less glamorous than wealth, and considerably more valuable to the people who actually had to live inside it. They had expanded the herd gradually, year by year, to the carrying capacity of the land. They had diversified. A produce agreement with 2 settlements to the north that used the kitchen garden surplus. A small contract for trained horses with a cavalry remount supplier that Hector had sourced through a contact in the south. They had paid off the second loan in full in the 3rd year and the first loan in the 4th, and the morning Cole had come back from Delacroix's bank with the paid-in-full document and set it on the kitchen table. He had looked at it for a long moment and then looked at Evelyn, and neither of them had said anything because some things don't need to be named to be understood. Cross had never returned to the territory. His license had been reinstated eventually, as these things sometimes were, the Bar Association's processes being what they were, but he had moved his operations to a different region and presumably found new targets, which was the part of the outcome that Evelyn could not make peace with and had learned to live beside anyway. Blackwell's property portfolio in the county had been absorbed by the farming consortium, which had turned out to be no friendlier to small ranchers than Blackwell had been, but operated through different methods, the legal and slow-grinding kind rather than the violent kind, which was a different problem for a different season. The Gerald Holt correspondence had eventually generated an investigation in 2 territories, which had led to the arrest of 2 men operating the scheme, not Gerald Holt, who remained a fiction, but the men behind him. She had read about it in a newspaper Cord had sent her, with a note in his careful hand that said, "Your early report was part of the record that made this possible." She had sat with that for a while. It was not everything she'd wanted. It was something real. That's on an October evening, the anniversary of the train, which she had not forgotten and did not observe as anything formal, but which she was always aware of. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window after supper and looked out at the yard in the last light. The barn, solid and familiar, its second iteration. The fence line straight and well-maintained. The cattle moving in the far pasture, dark shapes against the amber grass. Cole came and stood beside her. He had that quality he'd developed over the years of sometimes saying nothing at all, and having it be more articulate than speech. She had grown to trust that quality in him, the way you grow to trust the structure of a building. Not because it never moves, but because you've seen what it doesn't collapse under. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like," he said, "if he'd existed? Gerald Holt." She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. Sometimes, less now than before. And I think it would have been smaller, she said. Whatever it was, it would have been smaller than this. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Sadie was crossing the yard from the direction of the barn, talking to Birch about something, gesturing with the particular animation she reserved for things she cared about, which was most things. The light caught her face, and Evelyn saw, not for the first time, both the child she'd met on a cold October morning and the person she was becoming, occupying the same body with the ease of someone who had learned early to carry more than one thing at once. "She's going to be something," Cole said. "She already is," Evelyn said. He glanced at her, the slight sideways look that was his version of a smile. "Yeah," he said. "She already is." The evening settled in around the double W the way evenings did at the end of a working day. Not quietly, because there was always some sound. The cattle and the wind and the creaking of the barn in the cold, but with the particular texture of a place at rest. A place where the weight had been carried and set down, and the morning would bring it back. And that was all right, because the people here had learned the difference between a burden and a life. Evelyn Harper, Evelyn Walker, she had been for 6 years, though she still sometimes wrote her old name out of habit, and crossed it out and wondered briefly about the woman she'd been at the depot bench. Had not gotten the thing she came for. She had gotten something she hadn't known how to want. The distinction mattered, she thought, in the same way that most important distinctions matter. Not as a comfort, not as a lesson wrapped neatly for delivery, but as a fact about how the world actually worked, which was sideways and hard, and occasionally, if you kept moving and kept your list and didn't stop at the part where the ground gave way, more than you'd known to ask for. She turned from the window. The kitchen needed cleaning, and the morning's work would start early, and there were accounts to review before the week was out. She got to work.